Greed doesn't always wear a mask of desperation. Sometimes it wears a custom-tailored Italian suit and a smile that belongs on a country club billboard. Richard Vance stood at the defense table, casually adjusting a platinum watch that cost more than most people earn in a year. He didn't look like a man accused of devastating his own family. He looked like a man mildly annoyed by a temporary inconvenience. Just a few feet across the aisle stood his nieces, Emma and Lily. They were 22 and 19, wearing inexpensive, mismatched blazers, their eyes heavy from months of sleepless nights and unresolved grief. They were in my courtroom suing their uncle for $1.5 million, the entirety of a trust fund left to them by their late mother, Eleanor. Eleanor had trusted her older brother, Richard, a wealthy and supposedly brilliant investment banker, to act as the sole trustee. She believed his financial acumen would permanently protect her daughter's future. Instead, just 18 months after her sudden passing, the trust was completely empty. Richard confidently claimed that the market was volatile, the necessary investments were risky, and the girl's own living expenses had simply drained the principal faster than anyone anticipated. According to his narrative, this was a tragedy of economics, not a crime of malice. In his preliminary filings, he called their lawsuit a hysterical reaction from grieving children who simply do not understand how the real world works. I have presided over thousands of cases, and I can tell you this: a courtroom has a distinct temperature. When honest people are falsely accused of theft, they radiate indignation. They lean in. They desperately want to explain the details and clear their name. When arrogant people are caught, they don't defend themselves. They attack the intelligence of everyone else in the room. Richard didn't bring boxes of receipts, tax filings, or detailed ledgers. He brought a single, glossy, 2-page summary sheet printed on heavy stock paper and a leather briefcase he hadn't even bothered to open. He looked toward the gallery, let out a tight, dismissive sigh, and then looked at me as if we were peers sharing a private joke at the girl's expense. "Your Honor," Richard began, his voice dripping with practiced corporate calm, "I loved my sister deeply, but she spoiled these girls. I tried to manage their financial expectations after she passed, but you simply cannot budget for entitlement." Emma, the older sister, flinched as if she had been physically struck. She lowered her head and tightened her grip on a worn, leather-bound journal resting on the plaintiff's table. It was Eleanor's diary. Richard noticed the journal and let out a soft, patronizing chuckle. He truly believed he was completely untouchable. He believed his wealth, his polished vocabulary, and his status made him immune to consequence. He was entirely unaware that the very journal in Emma's hands contained a handwritten timeline and a forgotten offshore routing number that was about to tear his $1.5 million lie down to the studs. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client's financial history is impeccable." Charles Weaver, Richard's attorney, interjected. Weaver was a man who looked like he billed by the syllable. "This lawsuit is nothing more than a grief-driven fishing expedition. The plaintiffs are unaccustomed to managing significant capital, and they are attempting to penalize the only family member who stepped up to manage their mother's affairs during an incredibly difficult transition." I didn't address Weaver. I kept my eyes entirely on Richard. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice dropping lower, forcing the room to quiet down. "How exactly did you manage $1.5 million down to absolute zero in 18 months without a single major market crash?" Richard adjusted his posture, straightening his tie. "I invested heavily in aggressive growth portfolios, as Eleanor requested. The market is unpredictable. Furthermore, there were substantial medical debts from her final hospitalization, tax liabilities, and the girl's own living expenses, tuition, rent, travel. It simply depleted the reserves." He delivered the lie flawlessly. It was smooth, rehearsed, and entirely devoid of hesitation. "Did you ever open an account for the trust that the beneficiaries could not access?" I asked. "No." "Did you transfer trust funds into your personal accounts?" "Absolutely not. I am a professional, Your Honor." "Did you loan trust money to any of your own business entities?" He leaned slightly into the microphone. "There were no improper transfers. Every dollar was accounted for within the legal boundaries of the trust." I looked at Emma. She was staring at her uncle with an expression I recognized immediately. It wasn't rage. It was the hollow exhaustion of someone who had heard the exact same lie so many times she no longer expected the truth to defeat it. Richard mistook her silence for weakness. "They were never involved in the finances," Richard continued, gesturing vaguely toward his nieces. "They showed up after the estate settled with their hands out expecting a blank check. When my sister was sick, I handled everything. Whatever happened to the money was a result of the strategy she and I agreed upon. I asked what was left. For the first time all morning, Richard paused. Bodies confess long before mouths do. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes darted momentarily toward his leather briefcase. His right hand twitched. Nothing significant, he finally answered. I looked down at the black key lying beside his exhibits. He had included it in his initial filings to prove he had surrendered his sister's physical belongings, a safety deposit box key, from a local bank branch. But I had seen the number 417 before. It appeared in minuscule print on a seemingly unrelated bank document buried behind 50 pages of fabricated investment summaries. Why? I asked, shifting my gaze back to Richard. Did you remove the journal from Emma's apartment 2 days after your sister's funeral? Richard's confident smile vanished instantly. Emma slowly opened the worn, leather-bound journal. A single, folded bank slip was tucked inside the back cover. Something had been recorded in that diary for months. Richard knew exactly what it was. So did I. But Emma and Lily were about to learn that the missing $1.5 million was just the beginning of their uncle's betrayal. Mr. Vance, your entire defense relies on the premise that your nieces were unaware of your financial strategies because they were, in your words, unaccustomed to managing capital, I said, leaning forward. You presented a narrative that you were the sole burden bearer for your sister's estate. Yet, you seem quite agitated by the presence of a diary. Richard quickly masked his discomfort, forcing a thin smile. It's a diary, Your Honor, the emotional ramblings of a sick woman. It has no legal bearing on the structural integrity of a financial trust. Emotional ramblings? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Let's find out. I instructed my bailiff to approach the plaintiff's table. Emma handed over the journal. It was thick, the edges of the pages softened by repeated handling. But what mattered wasn't the poetry or the emotional processing of her mother's illness. What mattered was the meticulously folded bank slip tucked securely into the back pocket of the binding. I opened the slip. It was a receipt for a wire transfer. Mr. Vance, I said, holding the paper up. This is a receipt dated 3 weeks before your sister passed away. It documents a transfer of $500,000 from the primary trust account into an offshore entity named Vance Global Holdings. Do you recognize that name? The color drained from Richard's face so rapidly, it looked as though someone had pulled a physical plug. That was an aggressive growth vehicle. My sister authorized it. She wanted high yields. An aggressive growth vehicle? I repeated, letting the absurdity of the phrase hang in the air. I looked over at Emma and Lily. They weren't crying. They were watching their uncle squirm, realizing for the first time that the man who had patronized them for 18 months was nothing more than a thief in a nice suit. Vance Global Holdings, I continued, reading from a supplementary document I had requested prior to the hearing. An LLC registered in the Cayman Islands, sole managing member, Richard Vance, no co-signers, no oversight. You transferred $500,000 of your dying sister's money into an account that only you could access, mere weeks before her death. It was an investment, Richard protested, his polished veneer finally cracking. He placed both hands flat on the defense table, leaning forward aggressively. You don't understand the markets. I was trying to protect the principal from domestic tax liabilities. No, Mr. Vance, I corrected him sharply. I understand theft perfectly well. What you didn't understand is that your sister, while physically weak, was not cognitively compromised. She kept records. She tracked the money. And she left the map right here in this journal for her daughters to find. The courtroom was dead silent. The gallery, which had been murmuring throughout the morning, was completely still. Richard looked frantically toward his attorney, Charles Weaver, but Weaver had stopped taking notes. Weaver was currently calculating the severe implications of representing a client who had just committed perjury and massive financial fraud in open court. But that's only $500,000, I said, picking up the black key, marked 417. There is still another $1 million unaccounted for, and I believe, Mr. Vance, this key tells the rest of the story. Your Honor, the key in question opens a standard safety deposit box, Weaver interrupted, his voice tighter now, the professional polish starting to chip. There is absolutely no foundation establishing what that box contained, or if it even relates to this matter. Then your client should have no reason to look so nauseous, I replied. I didn't take my eyes off Richard. I set the black key down and picked up the second key, the small, silver one stamped with the letter V. It had been sealed inside the envelope, along with the offshore transfer receipt in Eleanor's diary. "Mr. Vance," I said, holding the silver key up to the light. "What does the V stand for?" "I have no idea," Richard answered instantly. His response came entirely too quickly. When innocent people are confronted with a strange object, they analyze it. They squint, they lean in, they ask where it was found, they display curiosity. Richard did none of those things. He actively avoided looking at it. His rapid denial wasn't born of confusion. It was born of sheer terror. I placed the silver key directly beside the black one on my bench. To understand why Richard Vance believed he could waltz into my courtroom and control the narrative, you have to understand the life he had built outside of it. Richard was 55 years old, a senior partner at a boutique wealth management firm downtown. His face graced the glossy pages of local business magazines. He sold exclusivity, aggressive yields, and total financial security to clients who expected the world to move quietly and obediently around them. His entire professional biography described him as a self-made financial genius. That specific phrase, self-made, always interests me. There is nothing inherently wrong with being proud of your success. But people who systemically erase every single hand that ever helped them often begin erasing other crucial truths as well. Emma, finding her voice, stood up and addressed the court directly. She testified that her mother, Eleanor, had not only paid for Richard's initial MBA, but had also provided the six-figure seed capital he desperately needed to launch his first investment firm 20 years ago. She believed in him, Emma said, her voice shaking but resolute. She gave him everything she had back then, and she never asked for a dime in return. She thought he was protecting us. Richard scoffed loudly, waving a dismissive hand. She invested in me because I had potential. It was a business transaction, and I paid her back with significant interest. You paid her back? Emma shot back, turning to face him. You took everything. I rescued her portfolio. Richard snapped, pointing a manicured finger at his niece. She was a librarian. For God's sake, she had no idea how to leverage her assets. I doubled her net worth before the market corrected. There is a distinct difference between assisting your family and financially exploiting them. That was Richard's private cruelty. He didn't just want more money than his sister. He deeply needed her daughters to believe they deserved absolutely nothing. In his distorted worldview, net worth did not just measure success, it measured human value. And Richard was about to learn that while a polished reputation might impress a country club, it holds zero currency in a court of law. Docs do not care about your zip code, dates do not care about your tailor, and bank routing numbers do not care whose face is in a magazine. Let's talk about this correction, Mr. Vance, I said, steering the room back to the evidence. Your Honor, if we are going to start debating investment strategies, Weaver began, standing up, but I raised my hand. We are not debating strategy, Mr. Weaver. We are debating a paper trail, I said. A paper trail that leads directly from a dying woman's trust to an offshore account and then to a series of very interesting real estate acquisitions. I turned back to Richard. The arrogance had entirely melted off his face, replaced by the panicked realization that the walls were rapidly closing in. He had assumed his nieces would never look past the surface ledger. He had assumed his professional title made him immune to basic accounting scrutiny. The silver key marked V, I continued, was not a safety deposit key. It was an access key to a private storage unit located in the basement of your downtown office building. The same storage unit where the bank's forensic team, under court order, recovered the original wire transfers, the offshore corporate documents, and the deeds to 3 luxury properties purchased through Vance Global Holdings just weeks after the money left your sister's trust. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Lily grabbed her sister's arm. 3 properties, Mr. Vance, I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the courtroom. A ski chalet in Aspen, a beachfront condo in Miami, and a commercial suite in the financial district. Total purchase price, exactly $1.5 million, the precise amount missing from your niece's trust. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Those properties were meant to be held in trust. They were long-term growth assets. I was diversifying the portfolio to protect it from inflation. Diversifying? I challenged. If these properties were intended for the trust, why were the deeds recorded exclusively under Vance Global Holdings? Why were the girls never informed of these assets? And more importantly, Mr. Vance, why were you quietly attempting to sell the Miami condo just 2 weeks ago, with the proceeds directed to your personal checking account? The courtroom erupted into a low murmur. Even the bailiff shook his head in disgust. Weaver slouched back into his chair, physically distancing himself from his client. He knew exactly what this meant. This was no longer a civil dispute over accounting errors. This was massive, irrefutable fraud. I needed liquidity, Richard stammered, the smooth corporate tone entirely gone. He sounded like a man drowning. The market shifted. I was trying to cover losses. I fully intended to reimburse the trust. You intended to reimburse a trust you legally claimed was completely empty? I asked. You intended to pay back the nieces you just spent 20 minutes calling entitled, hysterical, and unaccustomed to managing capital? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. The polished facade had completely collapsed. The $1,500 suit and the platinum watch couldn't hide the truth anymore. He was not a financial genius. He was a predator who had preyed on his dying sister and stolen the future she had sacrificed to build for her daughters. You didn't protect them, Mr. Vance, I said, my voice resolute. You exploited their grief to finance your lifestyle. And you thought because you understood offshore routing numbers, and they didn't, you had somehow earned the right to rewrite your sister's legacy. I looked at Emma and Lily. For the first time since they walked into the courtroom, the heavy exhaustion in their eyes had been replaced by a sharp, piercing clarity. They had the truth, and no amount of financial jargon could ever take it away from them again. Your Honor, if we are going to start debating investment strategies, Weaver began, standing up, but I raised my hand. We are not debating strategy, Mr. Weaver. We are debating a paper trail, I said. A paper trail that leads directly from a dying woman's trust to an offshore account and then to a series of very interesting real estate acquisitions. I turned back to Richard. The arrogance had entirely melted off his face, replaced by the panicked realization that the walls were rapidly closing in. He had assumed his nieces would never look past the surface ledger. He had assumed his professional title made him immune to basic accounting scrutiny. The silver key marked V, I continued, was not a safety deposit key. It was an access key to a private storage unit located in the basement of your downtown office building, the same storage unit where the bank's forensic team, under court order, recovered the original wire transfers, the offshore corporate documents, and the deeds to 3 luxury properties purchased through Vance Global Holdings just weeks after the money left your sister's trust. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Lily grabbed her sister's arm. 3 properties, Mr. Vance, I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the courtroom. A ski chalet in Aspen, a beachfront condo in Miami, and a commercial suite in the financial district. Total purchase price, exactly $1.5 million. The precise amount missing from your niece's trust. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Those properties were meant to be held in trust. They were long-term growth assets. I was diversifying the portfolio to protect it from inflation. Diversifying? I challenged. If these properties were intended for the trust, why were the deeds recorded exclusively under Vance Global Holdings? Why were the girls never informed of these assets? And more importantly, Mr. Vance, why were you quietly attempting to sell the Miami condo just 2 weeks ago with the proceeds directed to your personal checking account? The courtroom erupted into a low murmur. Even the bailiff shook his head in disgust. Weaver slouched back into his chair, physically distancing himself from his client. He knew exactly what this meant. This was no longer a civil dispute over accounting errors. This was massive, irrefutable fraud. I needed liquidity, Richard stammered, the smooth corporate tone entirely gone. He sounded like a man drowning. The market shifted. I was trying to cover losses. I fully intended to reimburse the trust. You intended to reimburse a trust you legally claimed was completely empty? I asked. You intended to pay back the nieces you just spent 20 minutes calling entitled, hysterical, and unaccustomed to managing capital? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. The polished facade had completely collapsed. The $1,500 suit and the platinum watch couldn't hide the truth anymore. He was not a financial genius. He was a predator who had preyed on his dying sister and stolen the future she had sacrificed to build for her daughters. You didn't protect them, Mr. Vance, I said, my voice resolute. You exploited their grief to finance your lifestyle. And you thought because you understood offshore routing numbers and they didn't, you had somehow earned the right to rewrite your sister's legacy. I looked at Emma and Lily. For the first time since they walked into the courtroom, the heavy exhaustion in their eyes had been replaced by a sharp, piercing clarity. They had the truth, and no amount of financial jargon could ever take it away from them again. Your Honor, my client's intention was always capital preservation, Weaver said, though he didn't stand up this time. His voice lacked any genuine conviction. He was speaking purely for the court record now, fulfilling his ethical obligation to a client who had just thoroughly destroyed his own case. The creation of Vance Global Holdings was a strategic tax maneuver. The properties were purchased to shield the assets from the beneficiaries. I cut in sharply. That is the only thing he successfully shielded those assets from, Mr. Weaver. I looked down at the 3 original deeds recovered from the storage unit. The ink on the signatures was black and bold. Let's trace the timeline of this capital preservation, I said, holding up the first deed. The Aspen property was purchased a mere 48 hours after the initial wire transfer cleared the offshore account. The Miami condo followed 2 weeks later, and the commercial suite, arguably the most lucrative of the 3, was purchased exactly 1 day after Mr. Vance stood in probate court, holding his sister's will, and formally swore an oath to act solely in the best interests of her daughters. I paused, letting the sheer audacity of the timeline sink in. You didn't just steal their inheritance, Mr. Vance, I said, my voice resonating through the silent room. You used your sister's death as a liquidity event. Richard finally slumped back into his chair. The immaculate posture he had carried into the courtroom was gone. The $1,500 suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big. He looked down at his platinum watch, perhaps realizing for the first time that time had officially run out. My sister. Eleanor didn't understand how fast money disappears, Richard mumbled, addressing the table rather than the bench. It was a pathetic, last-ditch attempt at justification. She thought $1.5 million would last them forever. It wouldn't. I was trying to grow it. I was trying to make sure they were actually taken care of. By putting the assets exclusively in your name? I asked. By hiding the deeds in a basement storage unit? By explicitly telling them the money was gone and refusing to show them a single credible account statement for 18 months? Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. I turned my attention to Emma and Lily. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder, Lily's hand tightly grasping her older sister's. They had walked into my courtroom believing they were fighting a losing battle against a titan of the financial industry. They had spent a year and a half being gaslit, told they were greedy, hysterical, and financially illiterate. Emma, I said, my tone softening significantly, I want to thank you for bringing your mother's journal today. Emma looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Your uncle sat here this morning and called your mother's writings emotional ramblings, I continued. He wanted everyone in this room to believe she was a naive librarian who didn't understand the complex world of high finance. But she understood exactly what was happening. She understood human nature, and she understood her brother. I looked back at Richard, who still refused to meet my gaze. Your sister didn't leave that bank slip in her diary by accident, Mr. Vance, I said. She knew you were moving the money. She knew you were setting up offshore entities. And she knew that when she was gone, you would try to convince her daughters that the money had simply evaporated into the market. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. She couldn't stop you while she was alive, I said, delivering the final devastating truth. She was too weak. But she made absolutely certain she could stop you after she was gone. Therefore, I announced, projecting my voice to ensure every word was etched into the official record, I am entering a full judgment in favor of the plaintiffs, Emma and Lily Vance, for the maximum allowable amount under this court's civil jurisdiction, which includes the immediate restitution of the documented $1.5 million from the trust, plus all applicable legal fees and associated costs. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, his hands trembling slightly on the defense table. But I wasn't finished. However, Mr. Vance, I continued, that judgment resolves only the civil dispute currently before me. The deliberate concealment of assets, the fabrication of investment summaries, and the unauthorized transfer of funds across international borders elevate this matter far beyond a simple accounting error. I picked up the thick manila folder containing the offshore corporate documents, the original wire transfers, and the 3 property deeds. I am officially ordering that the entire record of this proceeding, including the silver access key, the diary, all financial exhibits, and the property transfers currently held by Vance Global Holdings be immediately preserved. I am referring this entire file to the District Attorney's Office for a comprehensive investigation into criminal fraud, embezzlement, and elder financial abuse. Charles Weaver shot out of his chair, panic finally breaking his professional composure. Your Honor, there has been absolutely no criminal finding here today. I didn't make a criminal finding, Counselor, I replied coldly. I found a meticulously documented trail of evidence that requires people with significantly broader jurisdiction and much larger badges to start asking your client some very uncomfortable questions. This is completely unnecessary, Richard hissed under his breath, glaring at me. No, Mr. Vance, I shot back, leaning down toward him. What was unnecessary was allowing your nieces to struggle to pay rent while their mother's money purchased you a ski chalet in Aspen. A sudden, sharp sound erupted from the gallery. It wasn't applause, and it wasn't a gasp. It was the collective release of tension, the sound of absolute vindication from a room full of people who had spent the last hour watching a predator finally get caught in his own trap. My bailiff stepped forward, holding up a hand, and the room instantly silenced. Richard Vance looked at me with an expression of profound disbelief. He simply could not process that someone had successfully imposed a boundary he couldn't charm, buy, or bully his way out of. The moment you decided to treat your sister's trust as your personal checking account, I told him, delivering the final consequence, every single investment you made became undeniable evidence against you. His immaculate posture finally collapsed entirely. He sank back into his chair before I even gave him permission to sit. The man who had strutted into my courtroom radiating polished certainty now looked incredibly small, drowning inside his expensive clothes. Public confidence and a tailored suit can be bought. Character, however, cannot. I turned my attention back to Emma and Lily. Emma was gently tracing the cover of her mother's journal with her thumb. She didn't look triumphant. She looked incredibly tired. That is the hardest reality of justice. Winning a lawsuit doesn't give you back the 18 months you spent doubting your own sanity. It doesn't magically erase the stress of unpaid bills, and it certainly doesn't bring your mother back, but it does unequivocally remove the lie. Did she know we would figure it out? Lily asked quietly, speaking for the first time. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I looked down at the bank slip, the silver key, and the meticulously kept journal that Eleanor had left behind. Yes, I answered gently. That is exactly why she left you the map. Within 48 hours, legal holds were placed on the properties in Aspen, Miami, and the financial district. Richard's boutique firm was suddenly fielding calls from panicked clients and aggressive federal investigators. The illusion of his brilliance had evaporated, replaced by the stark reality of his greed. He had believed he was untouchable because he understood the system better than his family, but he forgot one fundamental truth. Money always leaves a memory, and eventually, the truth always comes to collect.